hope you don't mind. I'm going to have my own time going here, so it's easier for me. All right. So my name is Kenny Summer, and I'm going to be speaking with you on the topic of genetically modified crops. So GMO technology, GMO standing for genetically modified organisms, it's a more general term, is when you take specific genes from one organism and you implant those same genes into another organism to have that organism express certain traits that could be beneficial. By applying this science to crops, we are able to increase the crop yield and therefore feed more people. And some people, the main argument against genetically modified crops is the negative effects it can have on health of people and on the environment. But I hope that I can show you that my main claim, genetically modified food, is beneficial to humanity and should be funded and pursued, based on showing you these three facts: that you can grow more food, that genetically modified food can be richer in nutrients, and that research of genetically modified crops is a very possible solution for developing countries that struggle with successful yields. So, my first point, more food can be grown. Genetically modified foods are less likely to be attacked by insects, and the crops are less likely to be destroyed. Corn is often given a Bt crystal protein gene, Bt obviously standing for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a type of bacterium, and this gene is used to resist attacks by insects. So, that is the effect it has on it, because the gene will kill the insects. It's poisonous to them. So that means that farmers don't need a use of pesticides. Pesticides can be expensive, and a lot of, if you've ever been to an actual farm growing crops, easily square miles of crops, and 1 square mile that you have to spray down with pesticides can be extremely expensive. And it's also a lot more labor on the farmer's part to spray down all that land with pesticides. So, and due to the increased awareness pertaining to the use of pesticides, many people have decided to buy organic foods to actually avoid the health hazards that pesticides can cause. So, genetically modified foods are also resistant to disease. Rice is given a cholera toxin B subunit gene that helps it maintain its immune system. And crops can get viruses, that's a thing. The cells get attacked and they can just damage the plant. So by helping the immune system respond quicker to these viruses, they can be eradicated and it won't spread to other plants, so you can keep entire fields safe. Potatoes are given a gene isolated from the skin of tree frogs. These genes can come from anywhere. And this helps stop fungus and bacteria from causing blackleg in the potatoes. Blackleg is a mold that eats away at the potatoes, so it's really disgusting, a very visual disease. They have blackleg, and it's can destroy large amounts of crops. So GMO technology aids crops in withstanding herbicides as well. But herbicides are used to kill weeds, but not the crops. So weeds are growing all over the fields, and it's so labor intensive to pick all these weeds for so many square miles that it's easier for the crops to just spray herbicides on all the plants. But this herbicide has to kill the weeds, but not the corn crops, or corn in this example. So the same Bt crystal protein gene that was used to ward off insects actually also keeps the herbicides from harming the crops as well. And an abundance of you want to get rid of the weeds, because the abundance of weeds will hinder the crop growth by taking space for the crops and by taking nutrients from the soil that would have otherwise went to the crops. So now I'm going to get to my second point, that genetically modified food can be richer in nutrients. So less foods will supply more as a result of this. We implement 3 separate genes to add vitamin A to golden rice, 2 from daffodils and 1 from a bacterium. And you have areas in the world that will struggle to feed its citizens can benefit greatly from these advances, because less food will give them the nutrients they need. In this case, vitamin A can be supported straight off this golden rice. And one thing you've also noticed is that I've been mentioning, staple crops like corn, rice, and potatoes are all known as staple crops. There are 15 crops that account for 90% of the world consumption, so a lot of this research is done on those crops to because they're the crops that are mostly consumed by the world. So it's important that we get that technology, pretty accurate. So, and then my third point, research of genetically modified crops is the answer for developing countries that struggle with successful yields. Developing countries can use this technology to increase their crop yield and to grow crops that would not survive otherwise in their climates. In China, pesticides are subsidized by the government, so Chinese farmers can get their pesticides really cheap. In India, those farmers find it difficult to get their hands on the chemicals because it's not subsidized, and it's a lot of money, and they're not making money because farmers are generally poor if they're not being subsidized. So in 2003, Indian farmers began adopting the use of genetically modified crops by authorizing 3 BT hybrids, BT, which was used in the corn. So it's a very successful way to genetically modify these crops. And so now in India, you have these genetically modified crops being grown on their soils. And in early 2007, Frederick Kloppers developed a method for creating a maize plant that has resistance to maize streak virus, which is known for destroying a lot of crops in South Africa. Maize, if you don't know, is one of the staple crops as well. It's important that it grows. So what's really special about this is that Frederick Klopper is an African. He is the first this was the first genetically modified crop developed by an African to be used in Africa. And I think that's really good for Africa and all third world countries that could really use GMO technology, because if the country can do this research themselves and figure out this GM technology for themselves, then they don't, it's good to have a self-sustaining economy and not rely on maybe the U.S. to have that done for you. So in conclusion, I think that genetically modified crops is beneficial in several ways. More food will be grown, that's a fact. What is argued is that the health effects and the concern on the environment, but I, in my claim, said that, want to make a more important point that it should be funded and pursued, because I think it is the possible solution to ending world hunger and to feeding, most of the population. That's all. Oh wait, do you want this?
C. All right, the proposition's identified, but it's phrased as a policy claim toward the end of the speech, so you want to be careful about that, because you mentioned that it should be funded and pursued. That's a policy claim. The argument that it has a benefit, that's the claim of fact that you want to talk about. Now, there's a clear structure in the preview and the body of the speech, and there's a lot of factual data that you present in the presentation and a few examples to go along with it. The problem is that I don't see the demonstration. It all seems very theoretical. This is what it's supposed to do. This is how it's supposed to function. You mentioned that in India that they've switched to doing this sort of thing, and I'm going, okay, so where are the productivity numbers? Where are the yields that you're talking about having been changed? And I didn't hear any of that. You mentioned the example of the golden rice and how the nutrients could be added there, and that sounds very promising also. Is there a demonstration that this sort of thing is in fact happening? How long has this been practiced? Do we have any illustrations or even some authority who says, here's a village where they saved people because they had this nutrients, that kind of stuff. Yeah. It feels very speculative to me at this point, and somebody's promise is not necessarily the same thing as a justification for accepting the conclusion. I think that you need a little bit more of that kind of information. You mentioned the controversy at the beginning to show that there is a reason to talk about this, but the stuff that's most controversial about this is, our safety issues, for instance, and there's not really any discussion of the safety issue. And I think that that's probably the place where you would have the clearest dispute on things. In other words, in theory, that all this stuff is supposed to work, that might be true, but the dispute that most people have now is the argument that it's not safe, and then there's plenty of arguments as it is safe or it isn't safe, and I think that that would make a little bit more sense. All right.